All right, let's jump in here. So when we start with creation and Adam and Eve, the first sin, the stories of Cain, Abel, and Seth, and then a stretch of generations that connect Adam and Eve until the time of Noah, all of that goes in our first Bible time period, which is what?
Before the flood.
Before the flood. The first Bible time period is before the flood. What's the second?
The flood.
The flood. And then next?
Scattering of the people.
The scattering of the people.
Patriarchs.
The patriarchs. The stories of the patriarchs take us through the time of Joseph. Joseph was sold by his brothers into slavery and ended up in the land of Egypt, and that sets up the story of the
Exodus.
Exodus. After the Exodus, God wanted to take his children into the promised land, but they rebelled, and so they were sentenced to 40 years of
Wandering.
in the wilderness. After they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, under the leadership of Joshua, they were permitted to enter the land of Canaan, and that Bible time period is called
Invasion
and conquest of the land.
the invasion and conquest of the land. After some time passed, they were in the land. They would go through periods where they would rebel against the Lord. God would raise up one of their enemies to punish them. They would cry out to the Lord in repenting, and he would raise up someone to lead them and to deliver them from their enemies. And that is all in the period of the
Judges.
Judges. That takes us through the time of Samuel, the last judge. And as Samuel grew old and his sons did not follow in his ways, the children of Israel cried out and said, "Give us a king." And even though that is not what the Lord wanted for them, God ultimately allowed them to have a king. And that brings us to the reigns of first Saul and then David and Solomon, and they reigned over the
United
Kingdom.
all 12 tribes of Israel under a single monarch. That's the United Kingdom. After the death of Solomon, Jeroboam rebelled against the reign of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. And so instead of a united kingdom, the consequence was a divided kingdom. 10 tribes to the north, the nation of Israel, and 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, to the south, that remained under the leadership of a descendant of David, first Rehoboam and then down through the kings. We have we have the years of the divided kingdom. After a while, because Israel continued to rebel against the Lord and fell further and further away from him, God had Israel carried away into captivity by the Assyrians, and that left, if Israel goes away, that leaves
Judah
alone. After a while, Judah became guilty of all of the same sins, and God raised up Babylon to take Judah into captivity. After 70 years of captivity, God promised that a remnant would return back to Judah, back to rebuild Jerusalem, and that happened in the days of men like Ezra and Nehemiah, and that's the period of the
return
from captivity. And that gets us through the end of the Old Testament, closing with the book of Malachi. But between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, we have 400 years of silence. 400 years of silence. And then the New Testament opens on the scene, first with John the Baptist, but ultimately leading us into
of Christ.
The life of Christ. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell us the life of Christ. Jesus came promising that he would build his church. And so the book of Acts tells us the story of
Early church.
the early church. And starting with Romans all the way through Revelation, we have our last Bible time period. Romans through Revelation are
Letter.
Letters to
letters to
Christians.
Christians. All right, good, good. All right, so let's take a little bit of time. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn on Do Not Disturb on my computer. So let's take just a little bit of time tonight and begin building into our 17 Bible time periods. And again, what we're trying to do is just get the main points, just get the bullet points of each individual Bible time period. So we're going to start from the top. And I'm going to try to share my screen. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
So I'm just going to give you the main bullet points for our individual time periods. Now, as you've almost every time when we've just been talking about the time periods, and even when we gave the scripture references, Genesis 1 through 5, I've given you these 5 bullet points. You could have given these to me before I ever put them up on the screen. Genesis chapter 1, creation. Genesis chapter 2, Adam and Eve in the garden. Genesis chapter 3, the first sin. Genesis 4, the story of Cain and Abel. Genesis chapter 5, generations that transition from the creation stories to Noah and the time of the flood. I mean, you could have given me if and even if not each individual, if I had quizzed the group of us collective, I said, all right, give me the main bullet points in before the flood. You could have given me those 5, couldn't you? And so we've already learned some of this. That's what I want you to see. We've already got some of this. It may be floating around. It may not be quite as organized as we want it to be, but it's there. All right. So just to prove my point without looking at your notes. All right. If you just wrote that down without looking at your notes, Genesis chapter 1,
Creation.
Creation of the world.
Genesis 2,
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve, 3,
First sin.
first sin, 4,
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel, 5,
Generations.
generations. And when we say generations, we literally mean the generations of human beings that transition, that link us from the stories of creation, Adam and Eve, Cain, Abel, and Seth, all the way, the transitions, or the generations that transition us from that Bible time period until we get to the days of Noah and our next Bible time period. So all of that is before the flood. All right, before the flood. All right, anybody need me to pause right there? Do you need to make any notes? All right, so now what's our next Bible time period?
Flood.
The flood. All right, Jim and Vicky, what are the chapters in Genesis that go with that second Bible time period?
Genesis 6 through 10.
6 through 10. All right, 6 through 10. So here are the main bullet points for our second Bible time period. There are 5 in the first, there are 6 in the second, if that helps you remember. So you obviously have the story of the flood itself. All right. If you want to put, I'm turning over here in my notes so that I make sure that I don't tell you the wrong thing. If you want to go ahead and put scripture references with that, that's fine. That's not the most important part that we're learning right now. We're just trying to get the main points. But if you want to, that's Genesis chapter 6 through 8 is the story of the flood itself. That's from the time that we're introduced to Noah. God says the world is corrupt. I'm going to destroy it. Noah, I want you to build an ark. The preparation of the ark, the gathering of the animals, the flood itself. Okay, and it coming to rest on the mountains of Ararat. So that's Genesis 6 through 8. The next four all come in chapter 9. So after after the flood, after the ark settles on the mountains of Ararat, and Noah and his family get off the ark, you have some significant things that happen. Meat is given for food. That's significant because before that, they ate of the produce of the ground. Meat was given for food. God gave the law of capital punishment. The one who sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. That's the law of capital punishment that appears in Genesis chapter 9. The covenant of the rainbow. God says, I will never destroy the earth again by the waters of a flood. That's the covenant of the rainbow. And then the curse on Canaan. You remember the story of Noah's drunkenness, Canaan seeing his father's nakedness. That curse on Canaan is significant because it's the descendants of Canaan that ultimately are punished by the children of Israel. So that's an important bullet point. So that gets us through Genesis chapter 9. Meat given for food, the law of capital punishment, the covenant of the rainbow, the curse on Canaan. And then Genesis chapter 10 corresponds to Genesis chapter 5. Okay? And that is, it's another chapter of generations. And that fast forwards us to the time of the Tower of Babel. All right? The generation of Noah's sons. All right? So that's Genesis chapter 6 through 10. The Bible time period is the flood. All right? So let's just see what we remember. Try not to look at your notes. So the Bible time period. Okay? The whole Bible time period is what chapters in the book of Genesis?
6 through 10.
6 through 10.
6 through 10. All right? 6 through 10. So obviously, the Bible time period is called the flood, and so the first main point of that is what?
Flood.
Itself.
The flood itself, all right? And that's the first 3 chapters of this time period, 6, 7, and 8, all right? Now, we've got 4 things that come in chapter 9, all right? 4 things that come in chapter 9. So just remember, we've already been through the flood itself. Now, the ark rests on the mountains of Ararat, and Noah and his family come off the ark, all right? What happens in chapter 9? Even if you don't give them to me in the right order,
Meat given for food.
Meat given for food.
Capital
the law of capital punishment,
rainbow.
the rainbow covenant,
Curse on Cain.
the curse on Canaan. That's right, the curse on Canaan. All right, that gets us through Genesis chapter 9. Now we're to chapter 10, and chapter 10 is going to transition us to our next Bible time period. So what is it?
Generations.
Generations. Very good. Very good. All right. So now, anybody need me to leave that on the screen for a minute? All right. All right. Now, what's our next Bible time period?
Scattering of the people.
Scattering of the people. And where do we find that in the book of Genesis?
Chapter 11.
Genesis chapter 11. All right. Now, before I put these bullet points up on the screen, I want to see if I bet you can fill this in all by yourself because you know what this is about. So somebody tell me something they think is a bullet point in Genesis chapter 11.
Tower of Babel.
There you go. That's the first one. All right. And the second one is, so they built the Tower of Babel, and what happened because of that?
Languages.
Use languages.
God divided them based on languages. And based on our first two Bible time periods, I bet you can guess the third bullet point that provides a transition from this to the next.
Generation?
Generations. You got it. So you knew the bullet points of this one before I even began. It's not a question so much of what we know. It's a question of, can we put it in its proper context? Can we link it to the events around it so that we know what fits where? Now, the first few are pretty easy. I mean, these are the stories that we're most familiar with, right? These are the ones that we learn as kids in Bible class, and if we didn't learn them as kids in Bible class, a lot of us have taught them to kids in Bible class, or maybe taught them to adults. We've read the book of Genesis as part of Bible reading probably more than any other book of the Bible, because we start in Genesis and then we start to kind of fade out. And so, and then maybe we back up and say, okay, now I'm really going to buckle down, and we start in Genesis again. And next time we make it through Exodus. So those are the stories that we've read the most. And so these are most familiar. But again, we just want to put them in their context. All right. So let's move to our next Bible time period. And again, you can fill this in. What's our next Bible time period?
Patriarch.
The patriarchs. All right. And so if we're going to talk about the stories of the patriarchs, who are we going to start with? Abraham. And then who?
Isaac.
Then who?
Jacob.
Jacob. And then if we're going to follow the story through the book of the end of the book of Genesis, who are we going to zero in on? Joseph. You just filled in the blanks. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the story of Joseph. Joseph is not so much one of the patriarchs as he is the one whose story we follow that develops the whole line. Jacob is the patriarch through the story of Joseph, right? He's still alive for most of it. He's still the father, the father figure, the leader of the family. And Joseph is not the oldest. He's not the one through whom that would be traced anyway, generally speaking. Now, he does receive kind of the double portion in Ephraim and Manasseh, but that's kind of a side point. But Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the story of Joseph. If you are inclined to go ahead and put some chapter markers on that, I'll go ahead and give you those if you want them. Abraham, this obviously starts in Genesis 12. The story of Abraham takes us through Genesis chapter 25. Now there's kind of a simple way to remember that if you want. 25 is half of 50. I mean, it's, so we're not going all the way to 50. We're going halfway there. We're going to 25. I don't know if that helps you or not. But Genesis 12 through 25 is Abraham. Isaac is 25 through 28, if I remember correctly. Yes, had to double check my notes. And then Jacob is the focus of the story 28 through 35. Really, you might go ahead and say 36, though 36 is more about Esau. But you might say Jacob might as well say through 36. And then the story of Joseph picks up in 37 and carries us through the end of the book of Genesis. All right. So let's go back and see what we remember without
About 25 minutes.
Notes. Okay?
No.
Let's see what we remember without notes. All right? So if you have to, take your paper, flip it upside down, put your Bible on top of it, put blinders under your eyes like a horse. I don't care what you have to do, but let's see what we can remember. All right. What's that? I'm not still sharing the screen, am I? Okay, good. All right. So before the flood, Genesis chapter 1. We ought to be able to do this quickly. Genesis 1.
Creation.
Creation. 2.
Adam,
Adam and Eve.
Eve. 3.
First sin.
4.
Cain and Abel.
Cain, Abel. And then 5.
Generations.
Generations. Good. All right. Our second Bible time period is the flood. What are the Genesis chapters?
6 through 10.
6 to 10.
6 through 10. All right. So the first one is what?
The flood.
The flood itself. That's chapter 6 through 8. That gets us to chapter 9. There's 4 things in chapter 9. What are they?
Meat for food.
Meat for food.
Given for food.
Capital punishment.
Capital punishment.
Rainbow.
Rainbow.
Curse on Canaan.
The curse on Canaan. Good. All right. So that takes us through Genesis chapter 9. And then Genesis chapter 10 is generations of the descendants of Noah's son. And that brings us to our next Bible time period, which is what?
Scattering of the people.
The scattering of the people.
Scattering of
That
people.
is Genesis chapter
11.
11. And what are the bullet points?
Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel.
Divided language.
Using the language.
Language is divided. And then
Generations.
generations. Good. All right. And so that brings us to our fourth Bible time period, which is what?
Patriarchs.
Patriarchs. The patriarchs. All right. What are the chapters in Genesis for the patriarchs?
12 through 50.
50.
12 through 50. All right. And our patriarchs are
Abraham.
Abraham,
Isaac.
Isaac,
Jacob.
Jacob,
Joseph.
Joseph.
and the story of Joseph. Good. The story of Joseph. Good. All right. You just told the story of Genesis. All right. So, and now you know, if I gave you and pretty much if I gave you any chapter number, from the book of Genesis, you might not be able to tell me exactly, particularly when it comes to patriarchs, exactly what specific events are in those chapters, but you could put that chapter in context. All right. So again, don't look at your notes. Because I want you to be encouraged by this, because this is an incredible thing. Okay. If suddenly we had a mass shortage of teachers and we've got a class, on Sunday morning, and someone says, "Hey, will you come in here and teach Ella Bekejan's class, which is the middle class. We don't have anybody else teach it. We need you to come in here and teach it." Regardless of what they're teaching, you can say, "You know what? Let's review Genesis." And based on what we've done tonight, you could review the book of Genesis with Ella. You could do that. what I want you to be encouraged by that. I want you to, and this is kind of a, unfortunately, this word gets kind of a bad rap these days, but I want you to feel empowered by that. You have the Bible knowledge. You now have that you can be able to share that with someone else. That's a really cool thing. So let me prove that to you, okay? Don't look at your notes. Tom, Genesis 17. Tell me who Genesis 17 would be about primarily.
Abraham?
Yeah, Abraham. Tell me something that happened in Genesis chapter 11, Stanley.
Tower of Babel.
Yeah. Who is Genesis chapter 4 about, Laura?
Cain, Abel, and Seth.
Yeah. Alan, tell me something about Genesis chapter 37.
That's the beginning of the story of Joseph.
Yeah. Now, did any one of you have to look at your notes?
Yeah.
That's why I take notes so I don't have to remember.
But again, you have that, and that's a really powerful thing. That's a really powerful thing. Okay. All right. So we've gone through the first 4 of our Bible time periods. And that brings us to our 5th, which is what? The patriarchs get us through the end of the book of Genesis. And so what Bible time period comes next?
Exodus.
Exodus.
All right. The Exodus. All right. So these are the books of Exodus and Leviticus and the first 13 chapters of the book of Numbers. All right, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers 1 through 13. All right. So let's talk about the main points of the book of Exodus. When the book of Exodus opens, tell me about the people of Israel. Tell me about Jacob's family. What do we know about them at the beginning of the book of Exodus?
They've multiplied.
And slavery in Egypt.
All right, they've multiplied. They've become a large multitude in Egypt, and as a consequence, because the Egyptians feared that they might align themselves with their enemies or that they might rebel against the Egyptians, what had the Egyptians done to this large multitude of Israelites?
And enslaved them.
They'd enslaved them. So this begins with Israel in bondage. All right, Israel in bondage. Israel is subject to the Egyptian, to their Egyptian rulers. That's how we begin the story of the Exodus, because at the end of Genesis chapter 50, you're still dealing with Joseph, and his family's enjoying some privileges because of all that Joseph had done. And so the question is, wait a second, Exodus from what? All right. Right? Exiting from what? Well, Israel in bondage. All right. Now, if you had to pick one person who's going to be the main character of this Bible time period, who would it be?
Moses.
Moses. So we need to introduce Moses, right? We need to introduce Moses. So the next point is Moses' birth, which is pretty remarkable, because what was going on at that point? Why is it remarkable that Moses would be born?
They were killing the
They're
Young
carrying all
man.
That's exactly right. One of the things the Egyptians were doing to oppress the children of Israel was having the male children killed. And so the fact that Moses was born at all is a remarkable thing. So if he's the main character, we got to start somewhere with him. Makes sense to start with his birth. Now, was Moses immediately raised among the Israelites?
No, he was
No.
hidden.
How he was raised as what?
the Pharaoh.
Egyptian.
As
Son
an
of
Egyptian.
Pharaoh's daughter.
All right, he was raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. That's important, right? That's important because the first 40 years of Moses' life, he spent in a position of privilege, of education and training and privilege, not as a slave, okay? Not as a slave. And that's important because when he was about 40 years old, what did he try to do? In your own words. He tried to be the hero, right? That's my way of putting it. He saw he saw one of his Hebrew brothers being mistreated by an Egyptian, by an Egyptian, and he interceded and killed the Egyptian. He buried him in the sand, hoping nobody knew about it. The next day, he saw two of his Hebrew brothers arguing with one another. He tried to play the mediator, and they said, "You're going to do to one of us like you did to the Egyptian yesterday." He knew that he was found out, and ultimately he was going to have to flee for his own safety. But this is where Acts chapter 7 is really helpful because it comments on this part of the story. It says that Moses had in mind to visit his people. He had in mind to come to the rescue of his fellow Hebrews, but he was rejected by his people. He was rejected by his fellow Israelites, by his fellow Hebrews. So, because of that, what did Moses do?
Does he sit down?
He fled to Midian.
All right. He fled to the wilderness. And he fled to Midian. There he met and married his wife. He worked for his father-in-law Jethro, the Midianite shepherd. But Moses spent his next 40 years in the wilderness of Midian. And then something really remarkable happened that turned the story of Moses again. What was that?
Burning bush.
Burning bush. The burning bush. That's right. God says, "Hey, Moses, I got a job for you." All right? So that is going to send Moses back to Egypt. And it's Moses' job to go to Pharaoh and demand that God's people be released from their Egyptian bondage. How was God going to persuade Pharaoh to let the people of Israel go? What's next?
So the plagues.
The 10 plagues. The 10 plagues. And so you have the series of 10 plagues. God's persuading him to let the children of Israel go. And they ultimately come to the Red Sea with the Egyptian army pursuing. God parts the waters of the Red Sea. Sorry, I've got less than a minute remaining. I'm going to speed through this, and then we'll go back and spend more time with it next week. God takes them to Mount Sinai. You have all the events at Mount Sinai where God gives his law. The tabernacle is built. They travel to Kadesh. From there, spies are sent into the land, and Israel refuses to go into the promised land. All of that fits into the Bible time period, the Exodus. I know I pressed fast forward. I promise I'll slow down. We'll talk more about that next week. All of that fits into the Exodus. All right. Before I get kicked off of here, let me say good night to everybody. Y'all have a great week. Thank you for joining us, and you helped me remember where I left off this week. Okay.
Happy
Thanks.
birthday.
Y'all take care. Have a good week.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Bye.